I haven't seen Stephen's keynote myself, so I'm hoping that I'm not going to go over the same ground as he does. But I think there are, very probably common themes between our two presentations. So I'll be quite interested to watch that back myself later. But I didn't want to be too influenced by it. So I want to start my talk basically with a little bit of a kind of thought experiment. So I want you to basically imagine that you are not librarians, that you are not working at relatively well-resourced UK institutions, some more well-resourced than others. But imagine that you are a researcher working somewhere in the global south. You might be working on sort of medicinal properties of plants that perhaps your local communities have been using for generations. You might be working on sort of governance systems that don't really have a Western political equivalent. It might be that it's kind of oral traditions, oral historical traditions, that contain knowledge about the local area, about local cultures. But just, imagine that that's your kind of role. And now, you hear that kind of open access has been sort of solved. Everything is now open access. There's no paywalls at all. Everything is there kind of free to access at the click of a button. All the kind of world's research institutions. This is, kind of what we've been sort of working towards, what the kind of ultimate goal is. And I want you to kind of imagine in that sort of scenario, what exactly has actually been opened at that point. Because, if this sort of magical scenario happened and all the world's research was suddenly kind of openly available, chances are the majority of that research would probably be published in English. Chances are the majority of it is structured as journal articles. So it's probably got that kind of familiar sort of structure, sort of introductions, literature reviews, kind of methodology, results, blah, blah, blah. They've probably been sort of peer reviewed, probably by people who are, educated in, working in kind of Western academic traditions. They're probably indexed in databases that have been sort of built by Western academic publishers. They're probably indexed by similar databases. And most of that research probably doesn't engage with the kinds of research that you're sort of interested in. Perhaps they don't even recognize necessarily the kind of knowledge traditions that you might be working in this kind of hypothetical scenario. All of that kind of work doesn't necessarily discuss the kind of key thinkers or the key practitioners that you're working with. In some cases, they might actively kind of dismiss those kind of knowledge traditions or even ridicule them. So in this kind of hypothetical situation that we're talking about, where open access has solved all of its problems and everything is open, what exactly are we talking about in terms of what's open to us there? Now, I know that sounds like I'm being really quite dismissive of kind of open access in some ways, and I don't really want to do that because it wouldn't be accurate for a start. It would be quite ungrateful, and I think given the kind of work that I'm involved in, it would be a little bit weird. But I do kind of want to ask, and that's kind of the core theme of this sort of talk, about whether perhaps we've been a little bit too complacent, perhaps a little bit too maybe too easily sort of satisfied, and whether we've perhaps spent sort of so much time talking about access and how we can access, that we haven't really spent enough time thinking about what exactly is behind that paywall that we're so sort of focused on dismantling. Because I think, somewhere along the way, we've kind of confused access with openness. And I want to spend a little bit of time basically thinking about what we mean by that word openness, and how we have kind of conflated it with that sort of simple issue of access. And it's actually much bigger than that. And I think there are sort of negative elements to that we possibly haven't looked at enough, and kind of harms in that sense that are not as evenly distributed as they might be. So we have opened access in this kind of hypothetical scenario, but actually what we've opened access to is only a very sort of narrow slice of what we mean by knowledge. So I do want to start with talking a little bit about the kind of gains of open access, because I think, it is important to recognise just how far we've actually come, really. There have been very, very significant gains in the field of open access. Particularly, I think, when you start thinking about, where we actually started. We had that kind of really sort of rarely questioned model, the sort of subscription model of academic publishing, and it was very, very deeply entrenched, obviously very, very profitable, and we've sort of gone from that position and made it a really, really hotly debated topic, not just within academia, but sort of wider in politics as well, by asking those questions about kind of who gets to access knowledge, who gets to access research, why is publicly funded research, locked behind paywalls that only the sort of wealthy can access, whether that's individuals or institutions. And those were the kind of questions that really sort of kick-started the open access movement, and it has had enormous successes. Let's not sort of diminish that. A really kind of growing proportion of research is now sort of publicly available. It is sort of freely accessible. We have seen, funders and universities and kind of governments, get on board with things like open access mandates. This idea that publicly funded research should be publicly available, which kind of seems like a no-brainer, has really moved from quite a fringe issue to begin with to something that's really, by and large, kind of accepted without question. And that is, really insignificant. Not insignificant, that is really significant. But it isn't the whole picture. It is a sort of small sliver of it. And I think what I want to be talking about is it enough? Is it enough just to be sort of talking about how to make something accessible? Are we ensuring that what we are making accessible is worth accessing? Are we ensuring that what is behind that paywall is actually, representative of the kind of full sort of scale and diversity of human knowledge? And I think for me, the key issue here is that it isn't really. So I want to sort of ask a kind of question that sounds very basic, but I think actually is a lot more complicated than at first appears. And that is kind of what counts as knowledge, and who gets to decide that. Because I think every sort of institution that is involved in, producing, organising, validating knowledge has a position on this, whether it ever actually gets said out loud or not. So like in mainstream academic publishing, for example, what we're all quite familiar with, there's probably a sort of set of assumptions that we don't even really think to question, in terms of like what knowledge is. It's something that is produced by our institutions, produced by our researchers. It's something that is put into particular forms, by and large things like journal articles. It gets validated by a peer review. It's something that gets indexed. It's something that gets cited. And none of that's wrong. That is a definition of what knowledge is. But it's important that I think we recognise it isn't the only form of knowledge. It isn't the only definition. And are we kind of imposing that particular definition of knowledge on the rest of the world? Because I think it is important to remember that our kind of system of research, system of knowledge production, was produced at a kind of very particular sort of moment in time, in a very particular kind of cultural context. It's very much rooted within sort of particular intellectual traditions, traditions that, by and large were kind of sort of shaped by, Western European and then kind of later North American universities. And over the past few sort of centuries, 200, 300 years, which, incidentally have also been the kind of main sort of years of sort of European colonialism, that kind of definition has been exported to or kind of imposed on the rest of the world as the sort of universal standard for what sort of proper knowledge looks like. And what that's meant is that anything that kind of doesn't sort of fit within that sort of definition, or doesn't fit within that kind of framework, or those kind of recognized structures, has really been kind of excluded from this category of sort of true scholarship. And that's not because, you know, these sort of knowledge traditions are necessarily like less rigorous or less accurate or less valuable, but because they just don't look like what we expect knowledge to look like. They don't fit into the sort of structures or the frameworks that we expect. So if we take sort of, you know, indigenous knowledge systems, for example, and this is the example that tends to get used most often. You know, these are often oral traditions in a lot of cases. They're often very much rooted in a particular kind of time and place. They're often about groups and cultures and relationships between them. They might be held sort of collectively in a community's memory, rather than being something that is, you know, held and sort of disseminated by individuals. They're often rooted in, you know, things that tend to get dismissed from an accuracy point of view, like kind of metaphor, legend, stories. And, you know, from an outside point of view, this all seems, you know, much less accurate. And so they often kind of get sidelined when we're talking about our kind of system of sort of knowledge production. You know, they can't be peer reviewed in the same sense. Sometimes, you know, they can't always be sort of made openly available and written down, and sometimes they shouldn't be. You know, sometimes not all knowledge is appropriate for everyone, and that's something that often kind of cuts against this kind of central core issue of open access. And so they kind of get a little bit neglected within our kind of knowledge systems. You know, they can't be written down. They don't necessarily produce citations. And so they're either neglected, or what you often see is kind of outsiders, you know, like Western researchers, you know, often kind of extracting some of this information and reusing it, you know, quite often without credit going back to those communities. You know, we kind of take it out of one context and put it into another. And there are real questions to be asked about what does that do to that information? How does that affect that? And this is something that I imagine Stephen probably talks about as well, something that's called epistemic injustice, which is this idea that, you know, certain kinds of knowledge, certain kinds of people either get kind of trusted and believed, or they don't. Not because of the information, but because of kind of who they are or where they're based. And this is something that is you know, very true, I think, of the majority of the world's knowledge, which, you know, the majority of the world's population is from the global south. The majority of the world's language diversity is from the global south. And so if we are kind of focusing so intently on open access, but we are not addressing this kind of element of openness, we are really missing an enormous part of the picture when we are talking about open access. So we tend to treat kind of the way scholarship is disseminated, particularly I think in, you know, here in the UK and in our kind of Western knowledge tradition, as you know, it's just a way of disseminating knowledge. It's a kind of fairly neutral container. You know, journal articles, it's just how you publish research. That's just the way it's kind of got to be. You've got this sort of structure of, you know, introduction, you've got literature reviews, you've got results, you've got discussion, and that's fine for, you know, sort of scientific-based research, you know, kind of more empirical research, but it doesn't really fit with more kind of intangible forms of research. It doesn't really fit with sort of historical narrative, you know, philosophical inquiries. It doesn't really fit with, you know, sort of reflective practice, with sort of community-based practice. But it's just the kind of standard way that we've kind of come to accept that knowledge and research is sort of disseminated. But what's actually happening here is that the kind of the form that the research takes is pre-selecting effectively for certain kinds of knowledge. And if we treat that as just the sort of standard way, if we treat that as something that is neutral rather than an active choice, that's just kind of reinforcing those particular prejudices. It's just kind of reinforcing that injustice that certain kinds of knowledge fits and certain kinds of knowledge doesn't. So even the form that research takes, not even necessarily the content, but even the form that it takes can actually be a form of kind of closing knowledge in that sense. You know, the issue around authorship, for example, that seems fairly straightforward, but even there, you know, you can have certain amounts of kind of exclusion involved, because we have a very sort of individualistic notion of scholarship, kind of intellectual output. It is fundamentally built around this idea of sort of individual sort of acknowledgement, individual kind of, you know, citations. So, you know, a person or a group of people kind of authors some content, their name goes on it, their you know, institutional affiliation goes on it, you know, their citation count builds. But, you know, that doesn't fit for all forms of knowledge. Not all forms of research, not all forms of knowledge can be attributed to an individual. Some of it is knowledge that belongs to communities. And so how do you necessarily acknowledge that when it's something that doesn't map to a single author, that doesn't map to, you know, a single form of kind of disseminating that knowledge, putting it into a particular format. So this idea of kind of individual acknowledgement as well is also something that mitigates against certain kinds of information in certain knowledge systems. And I mentioned about language, but I think this is something that, you know, we kind of keep coming back to and really sort of emphasizes the importance of like bibliodiversity, you know, really the importance of trying to move away from the dominance of English language, because, you know, it is so dominant around the world. I think I looked while I was working on this session at something like the list of kind of top 100 journals in the world. And you know, I mean, I have issues with the idea of a top 100 list of journals that can be ranked in any kind of sense anyway. But something like 98% of them were either based in the UK or the US. And every single one of them, the primary publishing language was English. So what does that do to how we kind of communicate knowledge? What does that do to, you know, how we try and convey information? Because there are, you know, words for which there is no kind of direct translation. There are terms that exist in other cultures that, you know, don't have an English equivalent. There are ways of viewing the world that are really kind of deeply embedded in the language and the way that the language is constructed and the grammar of that language that really conveys something quite sort of critical to that particular culture or that particular form of information. And if we then try and sort of force that into an English framework, or we're trying to translate it, it's almost putting a kind of blurring filter on top of that information that we're trying to convey that makes it sort of less intelligible. It doesn't necessarily capture what it was originally intended to capture. There's a really, really good book called Braiding Sweetgrass by an author called Robin Wall Kimmerer. And she's a botanist, an indigenous botanist, and a writer from the Potawatomi tribe in North America. And she writes about something that she calls the grammar of animacy. And this is about how the kind of way of viewing the world of her people is actually really sort of directly embedded in the way the language is constructed. And she didn't grow up speaking the language of the Potawatomi Nation sort of fluently. She grew up like a lot of Native Americans do, with English as her first language. And so in many ways, she was coming to this language with a kind of outsider's perspective. And she writes quite a lot about the impact that had on her, and the way that she sort of realized how much the English language itself had shaped the way that she viewed the world. And when she started to, you know, explore the language of her ancestors, it really opened up her eyes to the way that they viewed the world, the kinds of knowledge and the kinds of traditions that she'd been learning about and researching that didn't necessarily kind of really come alive to her until she started to see the difference in the way that the two languages sort of viewed the world. So in Potawatomi, for example, things like plants and animals and rivers are all kind of grammatically animate. So they are subjects of that language. They're not objects. So in English, we would sort of talk about a tree or a river as it, and that's the same as we would talk about a table or a lampshade. And that kind of one simple difference, really encodes a quite complicated message about how different people view the world, and how they view their own part in that particular kind of community, rather than sort of being outside of it and observers. And that's something that she never really sort of understood completely until she started seeing these differences in language. And I came across this particular chapter on the grammar of animacy, and I thought it really, really sort of encapsulates how translation can change things, how translation can change not just the kind of intent of some piece of information, some particular sort of fact or some particular theory, but how it can really change, the kind of understanding and the ontology behind that information, and putting our kind of English sort of framework on top of it, really indefinably kind of changes that information. And that's something that I don't really think we talk about enough when we talk about translation, and how it can change so much the meaning behind the words as well. So I've talked a little bit about the kind of form, and I've talked a little bit about the language, but I think it's also important to think about the sort of the infrastructure that's involved in knowledge production as well, and the sort of systems that we're quite accustomed to. So something like peer review, for example, I'm not saying it's not a valuable approach. I think obviously you need some kind of quality assurance system. You do need some kind of mechanism to separate rigorous, robust, sort of scientific or other kinds of research from material which perhaps is not quite so academic or not quite so valuable. But I think it's important to think about what peer review actually is in this particular context. It is validation by one's peers. That is what peer review is at its kind of base. But it's only going to be as diverse as peer reviewers themselves. So if peer review, for example, is by and large drawn from, people who are from the same kind of Western academic traditions, kind of Western educational systems that produced the work that's under peer review, then you're only ever going to have this kind of closed loop, this kind of closed sort of self-referential loop that will just work to kind of reproduce those existing norms, those kind of existing standards. And when it comes across something that's perhaps, a little bit unfamiliar, it's asking sort of different questions, perhaps in a really different kind of intellectual framework or tradition, it's very difficult for that to get through, because, how do you recognize intellectual rigor in a system where you don't have the framework to recognize that, you don't have the context to recognize where it's coming from, or what kinds of issues or theories are at play here. And so it means that kind of unfamiliar material will often get kind of filtered out, and we'll just have the same kind of research over and over again. And that's an issue if we really want to build a kind of diverse research ecosystem. How do we fix that? I'm not 100% sure on that. I think certainly citation metrics are a big issue here. A lot of this kind of research gets published in journals that kind of, again, fall outside of the kind of mainstream ones, that often tend to get kind of swept up in this term of predatory publishing, where a lot of the time actually, things that kind of get classed as predatory publishers are often simply journals that, publish different research, don't necessarily conform to Western academic standards, are often operating on quite limited budgets. And I'm not saying that, some of them are absolutely not predatory, because I'm sure they are. But there's a lot of really genuine research that tends to get swept up in that label, because it doesn't conform to the kind of standards that we necessarily expect. And then those journals don't tend to get indexed. And so if they're not necessarily indexed, they don't build the same kind of citation counts. If you're not building, citation counts, that isn't necessarily going towards your academic track record. And for a lot of academics, that's what, jobs are based on. That's what tenure is based on in the US. That's what, gets kind of funding. That's what gets grant approvals. So it starts off as something quite small, but it really can build to something that can exclude enormous groups of people from kind of participating in this sort of research cycle. And then something that often doesn't get talked about as much, I think, when we're talking about the kind of diversity of open access and then the issue of sort of knowledge equity is what I like to call the plumbing, the systems that all of this kind of flows through, because there's a lot to be said there about kind of open infrastructure, and I think the open access movement's only really just starting to get to grips with open infrastructure in many ways. We focus a lot on the different kind of models of open access and the different kind of means of publishing. But I think we're still very, very dependent on a lot of the platforms and a lot of the infrastructure that is still kind of owned by the big companies that have a real vested interest in things kind of staying the same. So if you take everybody's favourite, Elsevier, for example, they are still the world's largest academic publisher, and they have really spent the last kind of 10, 15 years, quietly kind of acquiring, not just sort of journals and not just research, but the infrastructure that all rests on as well. So they own things like Mendeley, reference management tool that loads and loads of people use. They now own SSRN, the Social Sciences Research Network, which is one of the kind of biggest preprint servers, used for like law and economics, social sciences. They own Scopus, they own Science Direct, they own quite a lot of the kind of analytical platforms and databases that institutions subscribe to on top of their subscriptions to all the various Elsevier journals. So what you end up with is, even where researchers are publishing open access, in many cases that work is still being kind of hosted on, submitted, managed, discovered, measured through the same kind of ecosystem that open access was really sort of meant to dismantle. So the content itself is free, but that whole infrastructure that it rests on is still not free. And we need to be talking more about that when we're talking about openness as well, because there are alternatives. You've got things like the open journals, systems, which is open source software for hosting journals that doesn't rely on these kind of commercial platforms. Things like Archive are 30 years old now by this point. There are kind of collective sort of funding mechanisms. I have to give a plug to my own kind of employers, the Open Book Collective. There's things like the Open Journals Collective, there's SCOSS, there's Invest in Open Infrastructure, but it kind of feels like that often doesn't come into the conversation when we're talking about open access a lot. We really focus on making content open, but that issue of, well, where is it and who's controlling it, and who is kind of harvesting all this data as well that comes as part of the process of managing it and analysing it and disseminating it. Because controlling the kind of means of communication is a big part of the picture as well. And if we just sort of focus on the content and forget about the means of communication and the sort of the plumbing and the pipes, we are missing a big part of the picture there. And this is something that, forgive me for bringing kind of Wikipedia into this, because this is one of my kind of pet interests. I am on the board of trustees of Wikimedia UK, and I'm a big advocate for the role of Wikipedia in education, about getting students and staff and researchers to kind of edit and add to Wikipedia. But I think it kind of serves as a really useful example in this situation, because on paper, it is the most open project out there. There is no paywall, there's no kind of formal peer review process, there's no kind of gatekeeping in that sense. Anyone with an internet connection can edit and create articles. It's in hundreds of different languages. The whole thing is run by a kind of community-governed non-profit rather than any kind of shareholder-driven kind of commercial publishers. And the way content is constructed on Wikipedia is all completely open as well, in a way that it isn't even with scholarly research. All the arguments that go into what constitutes a Wikipedia article and what should be in there and what shouldn't and which links are valid and whether someone's notable or not. All of those kind of discussions all play out in the open on Wikipedia via the talk pages. Whereas, all the various drafts that go into a journal article, all that kind of editorial back and forth, all that kind of debate about, this should stay in, but that needs changing, and you need references to this, with journal articles and books, all that is kind of behind closed doors. You just see the finished product. So if kind of openness alone was enough to fix, the issue of open access, you would expect to see it in something like Wikipedia. And it hasn't fixed the problem. It isn't the solution. And part of that is, it is a structural problem. It's not an issue of goodwill. It's not an issue of people wanting to publish something open access. It's not an issue of trying to do it or trying to diversify. And the Wikipedia community itself is actually quite self-aware around this. And there's a lot of sort of debate within the community about how to address this issue. Because a lot of it is sort of structural. Obviously, one of the kind of key, probably the most sort of key pillar of Wikipedia editing is this idea of what they call verifiability. So you've probably all seen, articles with the kind of citation needed tag in it. Some of you, like me, may have T-shirts with it on. Some of you may or may not have been at a hotel recently that had a little sign about some historical stuff, and they had some historical facts, and I might scribble citation needed on it. Because the problem with Wikipedia is it's obviously built on the same sources that we're talking about here. And if you really want to diversify, then you're still reliant on those kind of overwhelmingly sort of Western sources, English language sources, kind of conventional news sources, conventional research sources. So if you're trying to kind of add community knowledge, or if you're trying to add something from a local newspaper that's never been digitized, or you've been doing kind of independent research yourself, however true it is, however accurate it is, however valuable it is and diverse it is, it cannot get into Wikipedia because it has to be published via these kind of conventional standard sources. And so the same kind of gatekeeping that affects what we're talking about in terms of scholarly publishing actually still counts and still affects something like Wikipedia, which is otherwise, the sort of most radically open project out there. So that should tell us something quite valuable, I think, about how just because something is sort of open in form, as open access is, still doesn't mean that we're going to necessarily get kind of openness in practice, that we're going to get that kind of diversity, that we're going to get that kind of range of information, because it still relies on this question of whose knowledge is being treated as reliable and robust. And so it's that we really, really need to address. Now, I've been pretty critical up till this point. Anyone who will know me will know that's nothing new. But I think there are real sort of steps in the right direction in this area. There are, projects, there are developments, there are things happening that are really important to recognise. Part of the problem is that they're just not necessarily happening in our institutions. And where they are, they're often kind of happening at the margins. So you've got things like digital humanities initiatives that are really recognising that just the written sort of form, the written word isn't the only way to disseminate knowledge. So there are kind of initiatives that are looking at how you can bring together kind of video and text and kind of oral elements, interactive elements, to sort of convey research in a way that is, perhaps more complex, more interactive. There's an example that's part of the Open Book Collective's catalogue. It's a book called Deep Maps, Blue Humanities. And it basically uses kind of different levels of interactive material to effectively sort of explain and convey the different sort of levels of the ocean ecosystem. So as you kind of descend through the different levels of the ocean, there's different kinds of media and different kinds of interactive elements that are sort of designed to really kind of mimic that sense of kind of descent through the layers of the ocean. And that's something really interesting, because it is trying to kind of convey not just information about something, but a kind of experience as well. and to try and kind of convey something that's a little bit more intangible. And I mean, I didn't understand a lot of it because oceanography is not my area of expertise. But it was a really interesting approach to research that I hadn't really come across before. You've also got things like community archives, and there's a fair few in Manchester. One that I'm quite fond of is a Glasgow-based community archive that collects things like zines, so like music, media, film kind of zines. And these are projects that are really rooted in particular communities that value particular kinds of information, particular knowledge. They don't approach it from a kind of institutional point of view. They don't always approach it from, a sort of trained archivist point of view. And they are collecting knowledge that is of interest to that community. And things that, more formal kind of repositories and archives maybe wouldn't necessarily have paid attention to or wouldn't necessarily have considered valuable. But they're out there, they're collecting information, and they don't often form the kind of corpus of things like our discovery services. They're not always accessible to us in the same way, and so they're kind of existing outside of that research ecosystem. You've also got kind of new approaches to managing things like Indigenous research. An example that I came across that I was really quite interested by was a sort of content management system in Australia called Muktu. And this is a sort of system, a platform that's really been designed in kind of harmony with the local communities. And what's really interesting about it is that it doesn't just kind of host a lot of information, it doesn't just host a lot of content, but it has a lot of access protocols been built into it as well. So it's not just about, here's this community's knowledge and it's openly available. These kind of protocols dictate that some kinds of knowledge can only be accessed by certain people, or at certain times of the year, or in certain kind of cultural contexts. And that's a form of openness that really cuts against our kind of definition of openness, which is kind of everything should be accessible to everybody all of the time. And it actually recognises that communities should have sovereignty over their own information, and the way that information is accessed, even if it actually means closing it, is actually a form of openness itself. And I think that's been something that we've sort of struggled to grapple with a little bit. So there have been various kind of principles that have been developed with a lot of these communities that build on things like the FAIR kind of principles, which many of you are probably familiar with, which talks about kind of how you manage data and how data is accessible. And the FAIR principles, I think, really kind of encapsulate a lot of how we sort of view openness. So findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And the CARE principles kind of take it another stage onwards and talk about how, not all data and not all information is for everyone. And the communities that it comes from should have more of a say in how it's accessed and how it's controlled, and who is using it. And that, that matters. That's something that's very important and kind of shouldn't get lost in these conversations about openness, that it's not up to us to necessarily dictate how information should be shared or who it should be shared with. That our kind of concept of openness and information and knowledge sharing, again, is not a universal standard. And that sometimes that openness actually does mean closing the door to access necessarily, if that's important to protect certain kinds of information. Now, I hesitated a little bit about using this particular quote because it is kind of a bit of a cliche. I think it is kind of overused, but I think it's overused because it bears repeating, and I think it bears repeating because we still haven't kind of got ourselves out of this kind of trap, this kind of cycle that we're in, where we talk about wanting to kind of change systems. We talk about wanting to make things more open. We talk about wanting to diversify, but we're trying to do that work, in the same kind of systems, using the same classification systems, embedded in the same kind of knowledge traditions, using the same collection policies, using the same suppliers. And that is it's not gonna fix the problem. It's not gonna make things open in a way that we want to. And I think a key part of kind of breaking free of that cycle is to ask questions, because that is really how the open access movement itself kind of got started. You know, we started asking those questions about, well, why can't people access this? You know, why is publicly funded research locked behind paywalls? And it's starting to ask those questions that then starts to get the ball rolling. And the open access movement really has achieved a huge amount by asking those questions and by keeping on asking them, and by kind of being demanding about, you know, the answers that we're getting are not sufficient here. And so I think the kind of core of what, you know, I've been kind of talking about at probably more length than I'm supposed to, is that I think we need to kind of start reframing the questions that we're asking when we're talking about open access. You know, we've come a huge way by, you know, asking about how do we open access, and I'm not sort of diminishing those gains at all, but I think, you know, it is time for us to start asking new questions, and I think particularly of us, you know, in libraries, and I notice myself still sort of saying us, and you know, as though I'm still working in the library, and you know, it's hard to take the kind of academic librarian out of the library, but I think we do need to be asking questions about kind of, you know, what platforms are we using when we're talking about research? You know, which subscriptions are we talking about? You know, what do these systems and these platforms do in terms of marginalizing particular communities? You know, our classification systems, we all know that there's, you know, issues with the Dewey Decimal System, with the Library of Congress system. So why are we still using them? Why aren't we doing more to try and sort of divest from those? You know, do we partner with local communities? You know, if not, why are we not partnering with them? You know, are there ways that we can introduce things like the data governance principles into our repositories, and looking at the research that our institutions are generating, and looking at how that data is shared and sort of disseminated? You know, there's a lot of questions that kind of need to be asked, I think, but you know, the way to start making these changes, which aren't impossible, you know, because 20, 30 years ago, we probably wouldn't have thought we'd get to where we are now with open access, is to start like asking these questions of ourselves and kind of interrogating things a little bit more. And, you know, stop asking just about, you know, who can access open access knowledge, you know, who can get at it, how free is it, how open is it? And I think we do need to start asking more questions about what is it we're accessing, you know, whose knowledge is it? Is it just sort of encoding a particular view of the world? What other views are there? How diverse is what we're actually opening access to? Because if it doesn't really, you know, reflect the kind of full spread of humanity, then, you know, why are we trying so hard to open access in the first place? So that's the kind of thought that I want to leave you with. I'm aware I've probably run over a little bit of time, so I apologise for that, but I hope we do have time for questions. If anyone has any, if everyone's kind of sleepy from lunch, that's fine too. But thank you very much.